Hello and welcome to the circus. I'm the small wet rat that one of the clowns found quivering in the cool flickering beam of a street lamp, before being so captivated by the glimmer of light in my big dark eyes that she was unable to turn away and subsequently raised me to be her highly intelligent animal sidekick and occasional side performer. In recent years, the Doctor Who franchise has made efforts to make up for its lack of overt queer characters by generously introducing a couple of gays to the cast, which has also nicely coincided with the trend of newer writers developing a much less cowardly approach to addressing the Doctor's own obviously queerly subversive tendencies. From the very beginning, there have always been traces of queerness to the Doctor and certain ideological leanings of theirs, as well as their relationship with gender and romance, which have become progressively more explicit over the years. They maintain a sort of casually amused disregard towards the confines of human gender roles and correlating social expectations, preferring to play by their own rules in most aspects of their identity and presentation, which is something that definitely resonates with a queer audience. The Doctor's engagement with gender is always shown with a degree of performativity to it, something they go along with when necessary, but that doesn't really seem to mean that much to them. This is consistent with how the Doctor approaches most institutional constructs of imposed social identity, and even without the overtly queer elements to their characterization, that is, queer as defined as explicitly gender and sexual nonconformity, the Doctor has always been a character who's willing to stray from the path of tradition if they think they can see a better way of doing things. And ever since their initial conception, they have served as a sort of symbol of escapist liberation from conformity, which is a vibe that, despite its vagueness, aligns with queer values and essentials. However, it's always felt a little inaccurate to call the Doctor outright queer, simply because of their disconnect from human culture and the constructs we abide by. The Doctor has always been a person with a certain inherent incompatibility with externally imposed methods of human categorization, simply by way of their being an alien, so it feels unfair to apply to them the same standard criteria of queerness that one would to a human character. This is an example of a common trope within the world of queer characters depicted in fantasy and sci-fi, that being the utilization of the fantastical as a sort of cop-out to avoid the anticipated controversy of including queer characters, by implicitly containing us to the realms of the imagination. Audiences tend to be less challenged when queerness is regulated exclusively to fantasy, as this removes the threat of queer thinking hypothetically imposing on the real-life structures we adhere to as a society, structures that more or less rely on us not questioning. This is why genderless characters are often robots or aliens in fictional media, and why, unlike human genderqueer characters, these characters are able to exist without serving the exclusive purpose of either being the focal point of a trans episode or the butt of a joke. The Doctor is an obvious example of this trope. After all, their views on gender are made clear to be directly informed by their identity as a Time Lord, and the fact that the fluctuation of one's gender over time is completely accepted within their culture.
She was my man crush.
I'm sorry?
Yeah. I think she was a man back then. I'm fairly sure that I was too. It was a long time ago.
So, look, Time Lord's a bit flexible on the whole like man-woman thing then, yeah?
We're the most civilized civilization in the universe. We're billions of years beyond your petty human obsession with gender and its associated stereotypes.
But you still call yourselves Time Lords.
Yeah, shut up.
Even so, the Doctor's experiences are undoubtedly queer on some level, especially when it comes to how we see them interact with humans and navigate the cultural discrepancies brought about by their unconventional experience with gender. They are a figure that defies and disrupts the cishet paradigm we are taught to see as objective, and in this way they are queer, even if they might not consider themselves such within the confines and rules of their own universe. Despite the potential for a pretty easy queer reading being present in the show from the start, Doctor Who has always had a somewhat tentative approach to its queer representation, which has mainly come in the last 10 years in the form of a few cis lesbian side characters and single-line references. That is, obviously, outside of the long-term encoded homoeroticism between the Doctor and the Master that probably started out somewhat unintentional, but that has been pretty much entirely embraced by more recent writers. As you might have gathered from the title of this video, something that I'm also hopeful for an improvement on in the coming years is what feels like a complete and utter lack of trans characters. Despite the show's willingness to make jokes concerning the Doctor's flippancy towards gender,
Never did this when I was a man. Yeah, that's right. My references to body and gender regeneration are all in jest.
the writers have until now seemed incredibly reluctant to outright include a trans character. Or at least you might think that upon initial viewing. In fact, I believe it's fairly easy to watch the entire show and come away without knowingly absorbing a single piece of the transsexual agenda, But don't let appearances fool you. There was a trans in there the entire time, hiding in plain sight. One revolutionary soul daring to defy the stark lack of transness across the entire franchise with her bold and unapologetic presence. Everyone applaud and welcome Lady Cassandra O'Brien. Delta 17, the trans Doctor Who character. Yes, that's right, we're talking about the uncomfortable piece of 2000s CGI that is the stretched flap of skin with a face whose primary character trait is being an uncomfortably horny neurotic eugenicist. And now I'm willing to bet that a decent amount of you are surprised, being previously unaware of this aspect of her character. If you already knew she was trans because you desperately googled queer Doctor Who characters one time, then congratulations, you're already the target of my channel, a gay person, and you need not hold the previous few sentences in regard. The rest of you will be converted in due time, hold still, I promise it hurts less now that we've adjusted the radiation levels. Lady Cassandra was not branded or promoted as a symbol of progressivism, or emphatically advertised as the first trans Doctor Who character. Anyways, in my heart, that role will always be occupied by trans mask icon Susan Foreman. However, by her own admission, she is in fact canonically so. She is the first transgender Doctor Who character. Extended media notwithstanding, the relevance of Cassandra's trans identity is regulated to the humble realm of a single line.
Soon the sun will blossom into a red giant, and my home will die. That's where I used to live when I was a little boy, down there.
Outside of this remark, transness plays no overt part in her character development across the couple of episodes she appears in. So what exactly does this line imply? For what reason did the writers feel the need to include it, and what does this joke tell us about Cassandra's character and the presence of genderqueer identity in pop culture as a whole? Cassandra as a character exists first and foremost as a commentary on the absurdity of beauty standards. Her extreme body modifications and unrelenting pursuit of a completely unnatural form are, among other things that we'll discuss later, blatantly satirizing the plastic surgery industry, and I think that's the most obvious interpretation of her character. With this in mind, we can immediately assume that when she references the fact that she was once a little boy, this is intended as a joke, playing into the extensive body modifications she's undergone, emphasizing how much she's artificially changed her body from what it originally looked like. The joke here is that the true extent of her procedures goes further than the audience initially assumed, which shocks us and makes us laugh in a sort of horrified bewilderment. The formatting of this line is specifically constructed to subvert our expectations as an audience, and the joke has a clear setup and punchline. Their setup is the mere fact that Cassandra is a hyperfeminine character with a lot of work done, and because of our preconceived cis-normative associations, we expect this sentence to end with girl. The punchline comes into effect when this expectation is jarringly disrupted, and we are unexpectedly affronted with the presence of unabashed transsexualism. Which not only shocks us on its own because trans people are terrifying, but provides us a wider exposition on just how far Cassandra is willing to go with her procedures. The fact that this exposition goes beyond what we initially thought of her and extends the absurdity of her character to new heights builds on the more gradual and less immediate camp humor that she provides throughout the episode, which adds another layer to this joke beyond the shock of the line itself. In all technical aspects, this is a well-constructed and effective joke, and I honestly think it's one of the few examples of pretty solid writing in what's otherwise a subpar episode in my opinion. However, this unfortunately wouldn't be an effective over-analysis of one joke, unless I also acknowledged and discussed the problematic implications and sentiment behind it. Time to pull out my extensive collection of genders and restock my pronoun arsenal while I tentatively approach the obvious transphobia here and attempt to make a cohesive point. The Lady Cassandra O'Brien. Delta 17 is, in the blandest terms possible, a problematic representation of a transsexual or transgender individual. That isn't to say that I'm in any way opposed to trans characters who are evil, depraved, and fucked up in all manner of ways, but in this case, trans identity exists as a comedic addition, intended only to add to her absurd villainy without regard for the real trans people who will inevitably view this show. As per previous mention, Cassandra appears primarily as a satire on the beauty industry. Unfortunately, this moral standpoint and how it's presented are incredibly lacking in nuance. That isn't to say that this kind of commentary necessarily requires nuance to be effective, but when explicitly dealing with a topic as complex as the detrimental effects of female beauty standards, I would consider employing a degree of sensitivity that the Doctor Who writers of the time seem to be lacking. A big problem this show has is its vague liberal and individualist politics that can convincingly masquerade as leftism when left without examination in a sci-fi setting, but that lack the complexity required to truly be as radical as they seem to think they are. A dilemma that becomes especially apparent whenever the show more directly approaches real-world issues of social justice. This issue is exemplified in things like how Doctor Who frequently handles the topic of race, presenting the Doctor as this race-blind saint who is so above the socially constructed notions of racial identity that they often blatantly disregard the concerns of black characters. We are expected to applaud how the show attempts to be both a raceless, escapist utopia, where the implications of how black characters are treated within the show are meaningless because the Doctor just doesn't see race so hard that it doesn't matter how they treat the black people in their life, and also an immensely political show with constant messaging about discrimination and bigotry. You can't be both of these things, and when a show like this tries, it generally just comes off as extremely tone-deaf. I think the main reason behind this problem is the fact that this show often seems fundamentally unaware of the larger scale that issues like racism operate on. Sure, it's cathartic when the Doctor punches the most comically racist man alive, but that alone feels insincere within a show that has constantly belittled and sidelined its black characters for years, while gaslighting the audience about how that's actually fine, because how could the Doctor be racist when he clearly thinks the concept of race is so absurd that his black friend being afraid of racism is an invalid concern?
Am I alright? I'm not gonna get carted off as a slave, am I?
Why would they do that?
I'm not exactly white, in case you haven't noticed.
I'm not even human. Just walk about like you own the place. It works for me.
Bro! Doctor Who fundamentally lacks sensitivity to the bigger picture of many of the issues it attempts to cover, which brings us back to why I believe that the commentary Cassandra provides is well-intentioned but misguided. The writers have an awareness that the plastic surgery industry is corrupt and predatory, and understand the most baseline critiques of modern beauty standards. However, instead of addressing the bigger picture, they are shifting the blame onto the women who are manipulated by this industry by presenting Cassandra as the root issue here. She is an unambiguous villain, and thus we are explicitly led to believe that her obsessive and unhealthy pursuit of modification is a moral failing on her part as an individual, rather than exemplary of a wider issue within her culture that targets people's insecurities for profit. On that front, I do also believe that there's a pretty large degree of misogyny within the point that's being made here, or at least in how it's being made. Instead of providing any larger scale critiques of the expectations women are expected to adhere to in our society, we are told that Cassandra herself is to blame for how she navigates the intersection of her own body image issues and how the expectations of the world around her affirm them, despite also being clearly implied to not be mentally stable. Rose, the cis woman, is presented as the moral high ground of the episodes that feature Cassandra, because she doesn't succumb to the same pressures leading Cassandra down the path that obsessively pursues artificiality at the cost of humanity, which is framed as an example of how Rose's rationality contrasts against Cassandra's denial. A large part of Cassandra's character arc in the episode New Earth is her coming to terms with her own impermanence. And while this can be read as more of the anti-plastic surgery sentiment expressed in The End of the World, commenting on the unhealthiness of anti-aging sentiment, I believe that there's a bit more to it than that in this one episode specifically. Cassandra is fundamentally a character who represents denial of the inevitable. She is terrified of her own mortality to the point that she's willing to completely sacrifice her humanity, and pursue a completely unnatural and unfulfilling existence. As we see in New Earth, Cassandra was happiest in her original human body, but she was blinded to this by her own fear and instead chose a life that at least Rose is sure is worse than death. She exists as a personification of avoidance, refusing to accept her own loss of humanity or the fact that she cannot live forever, and this concept interacts in key ways with the fact that she is a trans character. Cassandra is an irrational, jealous mess of a person who is aware deep down that her life's quest is futile, and Rose is a humble, rational contrast to this with all her natural cis womanhood. In a way, Rose has what Cassandra wants. She is an attractive young human woman, she is loved by those around her, and she is comfortable with the inevitability of her own eventual death. Next to Rose, Cassandra is a futile imitation, and this concept parallels transphobic TERF sentiment. Trans women are often portrayed as irrational, delusional, and jealous of cis women, who, like Rose, have everything they seek without having to try. This feeds into the idea that trans women seek only to imitate cis women, and places the standard of womanhood around a bioessentialist paradigm that upholds cis women as the one true definition of woman. Under this way of thinking, there is no capacity for redefining womanhood or cultivating a personal relationship with one's identity. There is only emulation. Strangely, I kind of almost believe that Cassandra's eugenicist race purity ideology was added as an afterthought to make her more unambiguously evil in the event that she might come out too sympathetic, which I say because this is never really what the other characters criticize her for. The disparagement leveled at Cassandra by both Rose and the Doctor never concerns her aggressive and harmful racist beliefs, but her failure to curb her own existential anxieties. If anything, her repeated assertions around her own ethnic purity are kind of treated like they're just there to make her a little more unpleasant. And I'm not saying anyone needs to provide a nuanced argument articulating why eugenics is bad, more that it seems unusual to include the topic at all when you have as little to say about it as Doctor Who did right here. Even when Rose does run out of patience and point out her backwards thinking, she relates it back to her own distaste for Cassandra's life choices, I assume to draw attention to the irony of Cassandra's obsession with being the one true human despite her form. Once again, the show treats this like it's exclusively her fault, and as if her ideology is a smaller part of her larger moral hypocrisy, which is the real issue. Like I said, it seems less like the writers wanted to provide commentary on eugenics, and more like they realized that their character was potentially reading too much as a victim and went, shit, I don't know, just make her a eugenicist, that'll fix it. Hell, if they wanted to provide commentary on eugenics, I'm certainly a little concerned they thought this was remotely the right way to go about that tonally, seeing as Cassandra's entire character isn't much more than a very drawn-out and admittedly dark joke. I think that the show set out to critique the beauty industry without the required nuance and fumbled the execution hard, letting their good intentions and vague idea of plastic surgery bad be overshadowed by tired misogynistic tropes and that characteristic 2000s demonization of hyperfemininity. But is there anything salvageable here? There is much to be said about the presence of more problematic media within queer history. For decades, we have been relegated to the roles of murderers and perverts, and it'd be lying to say that many of us haven't developed a connection to these portrayals as a formative part of our queer development. For better or for worse, to many people these portrayals are inseparable from our history as a community, and for those of us to whom queerness represents deviancy in its most unapologetic form, it's not unreasonable that we'd be able to develop a complex connection with such media that we wouldn't have with more advertiser-friendly representation. When modern queer representation tries to be progressive simply by adhering to the formulas popularized by straight media but with gays, it can feel hollow and meaningless, devoid of all that history and context. Queer people have been excluded from the culture portrayed in mainstream pop culture for decades, and we've built a sense of countercultural identity around that exclusion, which to many of us is an ideological lifestyle inseparable from our queerness. To write us into these white picket fence narratives of married domestic bliss when so many of us feel such an utter disconnect from those ideals can come across as very shallow. Under capitalism, all media we consume must be approached with a certain degree of skepticism, especially when it seeks to pander to our marginalized identity. Since the abolition of the Hays Code and the rise of more visible consumer demographics for queer TV and cinema, producers have been becoming progressively more aware of the market that exists for queer content. On the one hand, this is good as it provides us with new queer art explicitly made for a queer audience, but it must be acknowledged that the vast majority of this art exists with the goal of luring in gay and trans viewers for a profit. This can lead to newer pieces of queer media feeling sanitized, patronizing, or condescendingly desexualized, presenting only a tentative, politically correct, and brand-friendly depiction of queer life and identity that must appeal to marketability in order to rake in the largest possible profit. I'm not saying that every piece of queer media has to be a bury your gays tragedy by any means. I adore an optimistic queer narrative. I'm saying that the sanitized Hollywoodification present in a lot of productions that are obnoxiously sold as gay these days feels disingenuine to a lot of queer people. In an ideal world, we'd have awful gay Christmas rom-coms and Hallmark movies galore and no one would bat an eye. But in the world we do live in, queerness in mainstream media has been needlessly politicized, the queer community is desperate for representation, and Elon Musk is currently breathing. Because of this, it's hard not to be skeptical when a new show puts out interview after article after Instagram post about how revolutionarily queer or trans their product is, because they know that by doing so they're driving a profit. Thus, there is a certain immunity that more questionable representation is awarded to the horrors of rainbow capitalism. In Cassandra's case, The argument could be made that she surpasses her competitors in the world of weird trans rep simply by way of her status as purely incidental representation. It's not unreasonable to say that the presence of completely unabashed, depraved, problematic transsexualism like this is in a certain way radical. Cassandra was not made with a trans audience in mind, and as such she was able to avoid the common annoyances that come with producers trying to market queer stories back to us. This, of course, comes at the cost of everything we discussed earlier, but it's not completely outlandish why someone would resonate with her. I certainly do. In a world where we're constantly unsure of whether the support we're being shown by corporations is genuine or an attempt to prey on our starvation for sympathetic portrayals, a trans character we can be sure wasn't made with the intention of being for us can weirdly be a breath of fresh air. Cassandra also stands out with how she achieves this without being a completely unsympathetic character. Her trans identity isn't the sole source of the horror she provides. She'd be just as effective of a villain if she was cis, and she's a complex and multifaceted character outside of her transness. She's absurd, camp, tragic, and beautiful, and she is able to be all of that without superficially selling our own trans stories back to us while pretending to care. She exists as a trans person without being shoved down our throats as the first transgender Doctor Who character, and to me that is preferable. The Lady Cassandra O'Brien Delta 17 isn't a great portrayal of the trans community, but neither am I, and I think she's deserving of reclamation. Now, if you've made it this far, thank you very much for helping me in my quest for fame and glory. If you disagreed with any of the points I raised, that's completely acceptable. This was my own personal analysis as a trans person, and it was informed by a lot of personal experiences that aren't universal. If you're someone who absolutely despises this character, then I appreciate your ability to sit through this video even more. I'm currently attempting to make YouTube a source of income since I'm autistic and have very high support needs, like too high for most jobs to want to hire me. So if you're willing to like this video or comment something just for the algorithm, I'd love you. I'd very much appreciate it. With all that said, take care of yourselves. This has been your irregular installment of Overanalysis No One Asked For with Mercurial Rose, coming to you directly from my parents' living room. Oh my god. I'm home alone and I'm watching, like, I'm looking after all the cats because my parents are out fucking doing some gay shit. This is, like, harder than I expected. I'm constantly anxious that one of my cats is just gonna go outside and get eaten by an alligator or some shit. Look at this man. Hello.